Not only did apparently the crime scene get rearranged, but also Ron Cook and Neil Davidson had burned a lot of the evidence from the crime scene. They said that they were kind of wanting to clear the place up so it wasn't distressing for the relatives to go back to. So they ripped out all the bloodied carpets and bedding, threw them out of an upstairs window, and then had a bonfire in the yard of the
It's
farmhouse
crazy.
and burned it all. They didn't dust for fingerprints. I mean, it's an absolute mess.
Very early on the morning of August 7th, 1985, Jeremy Bamber received a distressing call from his father, Neville. Neville called in a panic, and he told Jeremy that his sister Sheila had a gun. It took hours for the police to finally enter the isolated British farmhouse, and by then, it was too late. Everyone inside was dead. Neville, his wife June, their daughter Sheila, and Sheila's 6-year-old twin boys. Initially, it was deemed a murder-suicide. But over time, suspicion turned to Jeremy Bamber. And today, he is in prison, guilty of killing his whole family. Jeremy has always maintained his innocence, a claim very few people took seriously. That is, until the team at the Pulitzer Prize-winning podcast In the Dark decided to take a good, hard look. Journalist Heidi Blake is the host of the latest season, Blood Relatives. I'm Kathleen Goldhar, and this is Crime Story. Heidi, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thanks. I'm so glad to have you here. This podcast is so well done, so deeply investigated. I'm really excited to get into the conversation.
Oh, thank you so much.
I want to start with the time and the place. Can you paint me a picture of the farmhouse, who they were before this tragedy sort of hit everybody in the family?
So the Bambers were described to me as being like local gentry in the little Essex village where they lived. It's a place called Tolleshunt Darcy in the middle of the Essex countryside. And the Bambers lived in this beautiful, elegant Georgian manor house called Whitehouse Farm. And they were part of a sort of distinguished family who farmed that area for generations and who were really revered by the local people in that area.
It's funny, listening to the podcast, like I'm Canadian, it really gave me a sense of the class divisions and sort of the history of the privileged in the UK.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a big part of this story, really, that part of the reason why this crime has become so just so kind of deeply part of the national folklore in this country, I think, is because it was utterly shocking to people that something like this could happen to such a wealthy, privileged, high-status family.
Yeah.
And, you know, that I talked to sort of people who knew the Bambers over the years and who really talk about how much they were looked up to, how much they meant to the people of the area of Essex they were from. They were kind of iconic in that area. And that was why this was just unthinkable to the people who knew them.
Yeah. So let's get to that unthinkable early morning. Jeremy has called the police to tell them. And how old is Jeremy at this point?
Jeremy was 24.
Okay. And he calls the police to say that he gets this very distressing call from his dad. Can you describe what Jeremy says happened that morning?
So Jeremy said he'd been all day that day kind of with the family, helping his dad out on the farm. It was harvest times. They'd been bringing in the harvest. He'd said goodbye to them at about 9:30 the previous evening and gone home to his cottage, watched a bit of telly and gone to bed. And then it was around 3 o'clock the following morning. He says the phone rang in his cottage. He stumbled downstairs to answer it, and it was his father on the other end of the line, sounding really distressed and panicked and saying, "Your sister's grabbed one of my guns. She's gone berserk. Come over quickly." And then he says the line went dead, and when he called back, he couldn't get through.
What kind of a family dynamic was there?
Well, I think this has been so deeply picked over by people who are interested in this case, because the wider family kind of had said that Jeremy was very much, you know, an outcast in the family, that his parents found him incredibly difficult. He says he has a very close relationship with his parents. But there had been problems for a long time with Sheila, Jeremy's adopted sister.
Both the kids were adopted, right?
Both
Jeremy
kids
and
were
Sheila.
adopted. That's right. They were both adopted. from different families into this one home. And Sheila, for a very long time, had suffered with paranoid schizophrenia, as had June, her mother, which is something that had been really kept secret from the wider community. So the family were seen as kind of living this ideal life, and actually behind the scenes, it was all a lot darker. But so Sheila had a lot of struggles for a long time, and as Jeremy tells it, this was not the first time his father had had to call him in to deal with one of Sheila's episodes.
Okay. And Jeremy's reputation in the town was what?
Jeremy was really known as a kind of local scallywag. He was tall and handsome and debonair and kind of incongruous in rural Essex. He didn't do any of the things he was supposed to do as the son of an esteemed local farmer. He didn't turn up to the young farmers club dinners. He didn't sort of really pull his weight on the farm in the way he was expected to. And he did things that ruffled feathers locally, like wearing makeup, which was not the done thing in rural Essex in the 80s, hanging out with kind of bohemian characters, and just doing a lot of carousing, drinking, smoking weed, going to strip joints, lots of things that really rubbed people up the wrong way locally. And so people basically didn't like him. They thought he was a rascal, and they didn't really know about Sheila's mental health difficulties because that was something that the family really kept under wraps.
Right. And as opposed to Sheila, who was quite a beautiful woman and outwardly more sort of following the rules of her place in society.
That's right. So Sheila was a successful model. She was an extraordinarily beautiful woman, so much so that people used to come up to her in the street and ask to take a picture with her, even before she was a model, just as like a teenager. People were kind of so struck by her. And that's really, when you talk to people who knew the Bambers or you talk to the wider family about Sheila, that's kind of the one thing they can tell you about her. She was just so beautiful. And it's almost like people were dazzled by that and didn't really look any deeper and see that she was very, very seriously troubled, haunted by terrible, terrible mental illness, and had been, struggling with that for a long time. But people just kind of saw, the manicured exterior, really, and that's kind of what stuck.
Yeah. So Jeremy calls the police. He calls on a local line and not calling your 911, which is 999. In the UK. He doesn't call 999. He calls the local cops. And what do the cops do? Tell me sort of as things unfolded in terms of now it's become a police matter.
That's right. Yeah. So he stopped to look up the number for the local police station rather than dialing 999, which was something that police later said was suspicious. But they dispatched a patrol car to the farmhouse as soon as they got his call, and they asked him to meet them there. And so Jeremy drove over to his parents' house and kind of waited at the end of the winding driveway, and then met the police patrol car. And then they then kind of figured out what to do next at the end of the drive.
And how long does it take for them to find the disaster, the tragedy that's inside the house?
Well, that's kind of one of the quite extraordinary aspects of all of this, really, because they arrive at the house at 3:48 in the morning, and they don't enter the property until 7:30 a.m., which for me is really extraordinary because Sheila was in the house with a gun, Jeremy had been told, with her two elderly parents and with her two twin sons who were 6 years old.
Yeah.
And so the police were told there are two children in this house. There's a woman in there wielding a gun. Jeremy told them that his sister suffered from serious mental illness. And they refused to go into the house. They didn't want to go in without armed backup. And the Essex police had very limited armed officers at the time, and so it took them a long time to get there. And even when the armed response team did show up, they still refused to go into the house for another 2.5 hours. They stood outside calling through a bullhorn for Sheila to surrender and come out. And only at 7:30 did they actually batter down the door and go inside. And by that time, everybody was dead.
And very, very quickly, they deem it a murder-suicide. What do they see that makes them think that's the case?
So when they got into the house, they found Neville Bamber, the patriarch of the family, who had been shot multiple times, including through the head, and seemed to also have been battered in a struggle before he was killed. They then went upstairs and found June Bamber, Neville's wife, who'd been shot in the doorway of her bedroom. The twin boys had been shot dead in their beds. And then Sheila was found on the floor of her parents' bedroom, wearing a nightgown and jewelry, and she was holding the murder weapon. It was lying along her body, and she was holding it directly beneath a fatal gunshot wound through her neck. And so, given the fact that the house was locked from the inside, and the fact that Jeremy said that his father had called him to say Sheila was wielding the gun, the police immediately concluded this was a murder-suicide and pretty much closed the case.
Yeah, and they also found a Bible on her chest, right? Or somewhere near her?
That's right, yeah. So next to her was this blood-stained Bible, which was propped open against her shoulder, and it had been left open on a page which read, there was a streak of red underneath the line, "Oh, save me from blood guiltiness." So that all fed into this picture that it looked like Sheila, who had actually suffered from religious delusions for a long time before her death. That was kind of part of her mental illness, was she was obsessed with the idea that she was the Virgin Mary or Joan of Arc. Had killed the family in a sort of religious psychotic break, and then had killed herself.
And we also learned that there had been a conversation with the family because the parents were worried about the boys, right?
That's right. So this is something Jeremy told the police as soon as he turned up at the scene, was that as he left the farmhouse the night before, he'd heard his parents saying to Sheila that she wasn't well enough to continue caring for her sons and that she should place them into foster care. And that was something that her psychiatrist told the police would have triggered a very severe response in her. He said she would have resisted that in any way she knew.
This seemed like such an open and shut case. When did things start to change?
That's right. Yeah, it all really added up to a very logical story.
Yeah.
And almost all the officers on the case completely accepted that conclusion. There was one officer, a guy called Stan Jones, who absolutely resisted that. He didn't like Jeremy. He was suspicious of him as soon as he met him. He just didn't like the way Jeremy was behaving. And so he kind of stood up to the detective in charge of the case and said, "I don't believe this. I don't think this is the right conclusion." But he was sidelined. And then what happened next was that Jeremy's relatives, his cousins and his uncle, who had disliked him for a long time and suspected him of another crime, a break-in that had taken place at the campsite that the family owned jointly, they all started to club together and try to persuade the police to reopen the case, to treat Jeremy as the prime suspect. And when the police refused to do that, they decided they were going to try and solve the crime themselves, and they set out to look for clues that might prove Jeremy's guilt.
This part of the story really shocked me, I have to admit. Tell me about that, specifically about a woman named Anne, who sort of seemed to take on that role with quite some vigor.
Right.
And then was taken very seriously by the police.
Yeah, Anne Eaton is quite an extraordinary figure in all of this. She was 35 at the time. She was Jeremy's slightly older cousin, and she really disliked him. They'd had a row quite recently about a matter involving the family money and inheritance, and she really had taken a strong dislike to him. And so she turned up at his cottage on the morning after the crime, ostensibly to offer support, and listened to him giving his statement to the police, and became suspicious of what he was telling her. Particularly, she didn't like the fact that he was saying that he was very close to his parents, and in her view, that wasn't true, and he had a fraught relationship with them. And so she reached into her pocket and found a scrap of paper and started to take notes on what Jeremy was saying. And that then became a real feature of the case. And Eaton turned into a sort of meticulous scribe of every detail of the investigation. She kept hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of note cards that are covered in her jottings about what was going on. And I got hold of those notes, which was fascinating, as a kind of portrait really of the family's efforts to prove that Jeremy was guilty. But she, her brother, David Beauflower, and their father, a man called Robert Beauflower, really the three of them were instrumental in trying to reinvestigate this crime, going into the farmhouse, hunting around for clues and scraps of evidence, and just doing everything they could to come up with a theory which could explain how it was really Jeremy and not Sheila who had killed the family.
What did they find in the house?
So the first thing that happens is the family, they go back to the farmhouse, they start hunting around. They actually go back to look for valuables, and they kind of raid the house for various precious items and including cash and other things, which they take away for safekeeping. in Anne's car. But they also look for clues while they're there, and they make a big discovery. So they go into a den at the back of the house. They open a cupboard under the stairs, and they find a silencer which fits onto the gun that Sheila was found holding when the family's bodies were discovered. And they have a close look at it and say that they can see what looks like blood on the end of it. And they then form a view that if this silencer was on the gun during the murders, it would have been impossible for Sheila to be the killer, because she couldn't very well have unscrewed it from the gun and hidden it under the stairs after shooting herself with it on. And so they then take this silencer home. Interestingly, they hold on to it for a number of days before they phone the police. And they then hand it over to the police. It ultimately transpires that this does indeed have blood on it, which becomes a key part of the case.
Anne also finds some of Sheila's blood on underwear that had been stained from her period.
That's right. So that's another sort of bizarre detail, is that while Anne's looking for clues, she finds a pair of Sheila's underwear soaking in a bucket. Sheila had been on her period, and she throws them into a trash bag that she then seems to have taken home with her and kept for years after the crime, which is an unusual choice. But Anne kept a lot of this. She kept Sheila's bloody nightdress. She kept all sorts of things associated with this crime for a long time, which is, again, unusual behavior. And so that became an issue later. There were all sorts of questions that ultimately emerged about the provenance of the blood in the silencer. Well, certainly questions that arose when I started to look at that evidence. But that nonetheless, the fact that the silencer had been found and that it had blood on it seemed to be a bit of a turning point in the investigation. But actually still, for a long time after the relatives found that blood, the cops didn't take it all that seriously. And it was only when Jeremy's ex-girlfriend came forward and made a bunch of allegations that the police actually started to take the relatives' accusations much more seriously.
What were the ex-girlfriend's allegations?
So the allegation was, so Julie Mugford is the name of Jeremy's ex-girlfriend. She actually now lives in Canada. She had been in a pretty tempestuous relationship with Jeremy for about a year before the murders. And a couple of days before she went to the police, he'd broken up with her. She was actually so angry when he broke up with her that, by her own admission, she tried to suffocate him with a pillow, and told him, if you were dead, then you wouldn't leave me. So having done that, she then went to the police, and what she told the police was that Jeremy had been planning to kill his family for a long time, and had told her all about the plan, and had ultimately hired a hitman to kill them. She told the cops that he'd hired a local plumber and paid him £2,000 to murder all 5 family members. And so that was the point at which the investigation really turned on its head, because when Julie Mugford came forward, the detective in charge of the investigation, who presided over the murder-suicide conclusion, was sidelined from the case. A new detective was brought in and kind of tasked with making the case stick against Jeremy Bamber.
Right.
And so that was the point at which the case turned. Actually, then, Julie's story pretty much fell apart, because it turned out that the plumber she'd accused of being the hitman had a watertight alibi. And so the story kind of didn't work. But the point was that the investigation had now totally changed tack. Jeremy Bamber was the prime suspect. And the police kind of focused all their energies from there on in on proving that he was guilty.
And it was enough to prove it in court.
That's right. So the case against him was basically circumstantial. The blood in the silencer was tested and was found to match Sheila's blood group. So they didn't have DNA testing at the time, but they did a blood grouping analysis and found that it matched Sheila's. And so at trial, the jury was told that the blood could only be Sheila's. Julie Mugford turned up. She told a different story at trial than the one she'd originally told the police. She said that Jeremy himself had killed the family, or she testified to support that case, said that he'd been talking about doing it for a long time. But basically, the evidence against Jeremy was really that he was the one that had phoned the police to say that Sheila was wielding a gun. And if Sheila had in fact not murdered the family and had in fact been murdered, then it can only have been him that did it, because otherwise, why would he have accused her in the first place? It's a sort of circular reasoning, and that was all that they had, effectively. They also argued that he had restaged the crime scene in order to frame her. And part of that involved pointing to the Bible, which was in a sort of awkward position against Sheila's upper arm in a place where it would have been unlikely to fall naturally if she'd been reading it at the point at which she shot herself. And so all of that seemed to suggest that the crime scene had been restaged and that had likely been Jeremy. It wasn't a clear-cut verdict. It was a majority verdict, so the jury took a long time deliberating. They sent a question to the judge while they were deliberating. Was there any doubt at all that the blood belonged to Sheila? Could it have matched anybody else? And the judge sent a reply saying, no, it did not match anybody else. And they returned their verdict 21 minutes later. And in a 10-2 majority found him guilty. And it's on that basis that he has been in prison now for 40 years.
I want to ask about one thing, and then I want to get into your investigation, because it really does, like, up to that point, I'm feeling pretty comfortable with the idea that maybe this is Jeremy just being quite smart about it. Although why he would hide the silencer in the house, I still don't quite understand why a killer would do that. But or a hired killer. How do they argue around the fact that the house was locked from the inside?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think it's one of the most intriguing parts of this whole story, because it is the classic kind of Agatha Christie locked room mystery. The family came up with an elaborate theory about that. They came up with a lot of theories, which Robert Beaufort wrote down in his diary and handed to the police. And this kind of ended up forming the backbone of the police investigation when they eventually did start taking the relatives seriously. Their theory about the house was that Jeremy must have climbed in through the bathroom window. And to be fair, he did acknowledge to the police in an interview that he did know how to jimmy open the bathroom window from the outside, even if the doors were locked. So he couldn't have exited that way because it couldn't be closed from the outside, but he could have entered that way. They then decided that he had exited the house by climbing out of the kitchen window, and that he banged it closed from the outside and sort of managed to tap on the glass to knock a vertical latch into place to secure the window. That actually doesn't really work as an explanation, because the window had two catches, one vertical, one horizontal, and the horizontal one couldn't be knocked into place. It was tested and it wasn't possible to secure that catch. So the theory doesn't really work, but the police adopted that theory anyway and told the jury that that was what had happened, and that he'd exited through the kitchen window, really without any supporting evidence of that.
Right.
Yeah.
And you get a chance to ask all of these questions to Jeremy. He's a huge part of your investigation.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it was kind of amazing for me to talk to him, because I guess a lot of people in Britain, this is a very, very famous case. I grew up hearing about it. It all happened the year before I was born. So I kind of, it was in the papers constantly through my childhood. And so I would hear about it. It was in and out of the papers. He appealed the case, so it kind of would come up again and again. And he's always been portrayed as this sort of dashing, handsome, cold, glib psychopath. And he did behave in a number of ways that were kind of odd in the aftermath of the crime, for sure. He did a lot of drinking and partying and kind of inappropriate seeming stuff, which looked really bad for him and helped the prosecution present him in that way.
And he became a very wealthy man. Everything went to him.
He would have done, yeah. I mean, so the alleged motive for the crime was that he wanted to inherit his family's substantial fortune. In fact, because of a reasonable enough law in Britain that murderers can't profit from their crimes by inheriting money from their victims, all of the fortune went to his relatives. So it went to the very people, Anne Eaton and her family, and other cousins who had put him behind bars in the first place. But yeah, it was amazing for me to talk to Jeremy, because he was very much not what I was expecting. Rather than being this kind of smooth, plausible psychopath, he was kind of rough around the edges and made kind of off-color jokes and didn't necessarily always know how to read the room, and was this just kind of imperfect, flawed, textured person, but someone who absolutely steadfastly maintained that he did not kill his family, that he had been unjustly convicted, and he's really devoted the last 40 years to proving that with a lot of grit and determination. And despite many, many, many knockbacks, continues to kind of bounce back and find the strength to keep going and saying, like, I just did not do this, and I will one day prove that.
You start looking into it, and I'm curious to know what you found that made that moment for you where you were like, this is something to look into. Not necessarily yet deciding whether he actually was telling the truth, that he was innocent, but what was that piece of it? What was that thing that you discovered that you were like, oh, there is significant issues with what the police and the prosecutors say happened?
Well, just actually looking at the files themselves. So early on in the investigation, Jeremy shared with me all of the evidence that has been disclosed in this case over the years, and an awful lot of that had been withheld from the jury at trials. I think, one of the most troubling things was that the blood in the silencer that the jury had been told could only have been Sheila did not only match Sheila. It
Hmm.
also matched Robert Bowflower, who was the uncle who had put together this theory of the crime that kind of led the police ultimately, kind of really shaped the way they presented the case at trial, whose family had ultimately inherited all of the family money, and who had suspected Jeremy from the very beginning. And he had been present when the cousins found the silencer under the stairs. They'd held onto it for 2 days. And so, the fact that the jury had not been told that it also could have matched him and that he had been there when the silencer was found, to me was extraordinary. I mean, it just meant the jury had been totally misled
Yeah.
on that point. And, then I discovered that Anne Eaton also had access to Sheila's blood. She'd found these underpants. And in fact, I found notes which showed that the police had been concerned that she might have been accused of contaminating the silencer at trial. It actually never came up. But so they were also aware of that issue. And so that was a point at which I started to think, well, the silencer was the linchpin of this case. That blood in the silencer was what convicted him. And if actually that's in doubt, there's an awful lot, there are real questions to ask here. And so that's when I really sort of dug in and started talking to witnesses and police officers who've been involved and really made some pretty astonishing discoveries.
You did. So let's talk about some of those discoveries. A big part of it was just how bumbling the first head investigator was.
Bumbling Ron, yes, quite an extraordinary character in all of this. So, yeah, I really wanted to understand sort of the way that the crime scene had been handled by the cops.
Yeah.
And I found as I went through the files a load of notes from investigators involved in the case, which raised some questions about the position of Sheila's body and also of the Bible that had been found next to it. Now, this all was pretty crucial to the suggestion that Jeremy Bamber had staged the crime scene and the way in which that scene had all been arranged. And these officers were saying that Sheila's body and the Bible looked like they might have been moved. None of that had been ever aired in court or really tested or examined, but I wanted to know more about it. And so I found a detective called Neil Davidson, who had been present at the point at which the bodies were examined by Essex Police's lead crime scene investigator at the time, a man called Ron Cook. Now, Neil Davidson told me that Ron Cook had acquired an unfortunate nickname during his years on the force, Bumbling Ron, because he was so hapless and tended to make a mess of crime scenes that he was involved with. And as I asked Neil Davidson about what had happened at this particular crime scene, he told me that he'd witnessed Ron Cook picking up the Bible that had been on Sheila's body and rifling through it before putting it back and having to make a guess about where he'd picked it up from, and that this had happened before the crime scene photos were taken. I asked him, had they moved the body itself? He said he thought Ron had probably moved the arms, although he said they hadn't dragged it anywhere, but that the arms maybe had been moved. And he also thought that Ron Cook might have moved the gun that was on top of Sheila's body. So this was very much contrary to what the jury had been told at trial. Ron Cook testified that nothing had been moved before the photos were taken. It absolutely corroborated what the concerns these officers had raised in notes internally, that it seemed like that scene had been rearranged. And it really undermines the police case that Jeremy Bamber is the person who restaged that crime scene in order to frame Sheila. In fact, what Neil Davidson is saying is it was the police's own crime scene investigator who rearranged that crime scene.
Yeah, I also cannot get over the fact that the silencer was used as evidence at all, considering that it hadn't gone straight to the police. There was no sense, like what's the language that the police use? Like the evidence.
Chain of custody, yeah.
Yeah, it's gone. How is that possible that no judge ever said the silencer has to be excluded?
I agree. I mean, it's bananas. I mean, that silencer is utterly compromised as a piece of forensic evidence. It had been The relatives had all handled it. They'd tried to unscrew it. It had then been stashed in the bottom of Anne Eaton's husband's wardrobe for 2 days before the police picked it up. When the police officer did turn up to collect the silencer, he stopped and drank a bottle of whiskey with Anne's husband, Peter, shoved the silencer into a paper towel tube and then threw it into the trunk of his car before drink driving back to the station and stashing it in his desk drawer. All of this happened before it gets to the lab. So it's totally compromised, not to mention the fact that bumbling Ron himself then took it away from the lab for 17 days before it was properly blood tested. And we don't know anything about what happened during that time because there were no proper records kept about its whereabouts. So as you say, it's pretty much worthless as a piece of forensic evidence. And the jury doesn't know about any of this. And, I can't believe that a jury today would treat that as a serious piece of evidence in this case.
And because they deemed it a murder-suicide so quickly, so much evidence was actually destroyed.
Yeah, I mean, that's another one of the kind of unbelievable things here is that, not only did apparently the crime scene get rearranged, but also Ron Cook and Neil Davidson had burned a lot of the evidence from the crime scene. They said that they were kind of wanting to clear the place up so it wasn't distressing for the relatives to go back to. So they ripped out all the bloodied carpets and bedding, threw them out of an upstairs window, and then had a bonfire in the yard of the farmhouse and burned it all. They didn't dust for fingerprints. I mean, it's an absolute mess.
It's a real mess. But to me, the nail in the coffin, so to speak, which is a terrible metaphor to use for this, but was your connecting with the guy who got the 999 call. That to me was astounding. So tell me about, his name was Nick Milbank, right?
Yeah, that's right. For me, that was the moment where I really felt this conviction really, is really unsafe. Like, this thing has to be retried, or we need it, at the very least, an appeal. So an appeal needs to be heard. So I found a reference in the case files that I was going through to a phone call that had apparently been made at 6:09 in the morning. It was a 999 call, so an emergency call from inside the farmhouse. And at 6:09, Jeremy had been standing outside with the police since 3:48 a.m. So he'd been out there for ages. Everyone inside was ultimately found shot in the head. So there was no way that if Jeremy was the killer, someone was still alive inside the farmhouse at 6:09 in the morning and able to call the police. This reference to a 999 call kind of contradicted the police's official version of events, which was that there was the phone in the kitchen had been left off the hook and the officers were just listening into the open line to monitor what's going on. But I saw that the person that was listed as taking the call was this man, Nick Milbank, and so I found him. He actually still worked for Essex Police, and I just called him up and said, "Hey, I hear you were monitoring the phone lines that night. Can you tell me what happened?" And I didn't even ask him about a 999 call. He immediately said, "Oh yeah, someone dialed 999 from inside the farmhouse." And he told me that he had heard signs, he's heard movements, he'd heard what he thought might be voices, and he'd hung on to the line for quite some time before the police ultimately entered. He didn't hear, no one sort of spoke to him directly, but it was police policy to stay on the line if you got a sort of abandoned call like that. I said to him, "Well, this means someone must have been alive in there." And he said, "Well, obviously." And then more extraordinary than that, I said to him, "Well, how come you've never testified about this?" And more than that, there's actually a statement in your name that's been produced by police which makes no mention of this call whatsoever. He said to me, "I've never given anyone a statement. I haven't spoken to anyone about this case since the 1980s, other than you." And when I sent him a copy of the statement that he's supposed to have given, which has been produced in court as part of the evidence, he said that he'd never given that statement. He didn't recognize it, didn't believe that he'd given it, and that there were multiple things about it that did not ring true, that he would never have written, including the way that his name seemed to have been signed on this document. And so that really, for me, was the moment where I felt this case falls apart.
Yeah. What do you think happened? Do you think it was a murder-suicide?
I think, for one thing, it's never going to be possible to say for certain exactly what happened inside that house 40 years later when half the evidence was burned and a lot more was seriously compromised. But I think that the evidence points to Sheila. I think the house was locked. She was holding a murder weapon. She had a very seriously troubled psychiatric history. We know, because I confirmed it with people who knew, that her parents were indeed pushing for her children to be put in foster care. Her own psychiatrist said she would resist that in any way she knew. There were actually notes in the files that appear to have been written by Sheila, which look very much like suicide notes, where she says, Me and my babies will go to our rest. And, we know that she was someone who deeply feared losing her children. But had also talked to her psychiatrist about fearing that she might harm them. She had fantasies, kind of violent fantasies about the boys. She also feared that they might kill her. And she was very, very troubled. She told her psychiatrist at one point that her greatest fear was that she might kill her children. So I think with all of that added together, you know, that that makes sense.
Yeah.
That Sheila is clearly the person who looks most likely to have committed this crime. We now also know that there was a phone call from inside the farmhouse, according to a police officer who was on the line, and there were various other signs of life in the house as well that were recorded at the time by police officers on the scene. So that to me seems very much the most likely explanation for all of this. But certainly the evidence that was presented at trial that Jeremy Bamber was responsible is in tatters.
That's sort of, to me, it's like whether or not you prove Jeremy's innocence, which, it was sort of besides the point. I felt like it was so clearly a problematic conviction. Where are we at with Jeremy's still in prison? I mean, what's going on? Why is he still in prison?
So I published an article about my findings in this case last year in the New Yorker, which outlined the 999 call, the evidence that the crime scene had been interfered with by police officers, and a lot more. And that was the basis of fresh submissions to the CCRC by Jeremy's campaign team. The CCRC is the body in the UK which investigates wrongful convictions. And so they had been conducting an expedited review of the case based on the fresh evidence that I'd unearthed in this investigation. And I really thought, surely this is the basis on which they will refer this case to the Court of Appeal for a fresh hearing. But they came back in June with a statement of reasons for refusing to refer Jeremy's case. And the thing that really astonished me was that they had not spoken to Nick Milbank or to Neil Davidson or to any of the people that I interviewed in my investigation who gave brand new evidence about what happened on the night of the crime and afterwards. They hadn't bothered to interview them. They had just concluded that, the reference to a 999 call was an administrative error, that there was no reason why the jury might reconsider the verdict based on the fact that the crime scene might have been rearranged by the police. I mean, they just found convoluted reasons to wave everything away. We're hoping that now that we've put the podcast out, which includes the tapes of these interviews, so you can hear these police officers describing in their own words, in their own time, what happened. We're hoping that the CCRC will now reconsider that decision and take this evidence much more seriously. And I know that Jeremy Bamber's team are preparing to make fresh submissions shortly in the next few days on the basis of fresh evidence that's in the podcast. And so perhaps there will be another opportunity for this case to go back to the Court of Appeal. But at the moment, Jeremy's had 2 failed appeals already. The CCRC has refused to refer the case back to the Court of Appeal. And so he's still in prison and likely to remain there.
I know we have to wrap up soon, so I just want to ask you a little bit about what do you think happened with the original investigation and the family? When and how did Anne and Robert and all of them sort of become the lead investigators? How did that happen?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what happened with the relatives was I think they genuinely deeply distrusted Jeremy. I think they didn't really understand Sheila's mental illness at all. They thought that she was gentle and beautiful and kind and loving, and they couldn't conceive that she might have done this. And they absolutely could conceive that Jeremy Bamber could have done this. His uncle wrote, "I loathed that boy and couldn't bear to be anywhere near him," and said that he thought that Jeremy had sold his soul to the devil. And so they formed a view early on that Jeremy must be guilty. It couldn't be Sheila. And then when the police refused to countenance that idea, I think that they became genuinely very troubled by that. I think they thought he was going to get away with it. They became frightened that he might come after them. And they set about trying to do anything to prove that it was him. And I think that that's the problem with having family members, people who are emotionally and in this case financially invested in the outcome, lead the investigation, is that that is not going to lead to reliable evidence being gathered or a reliable theory of the case being developed. And it was really when the police sort of had to change tack and had to point all their suspicion at Jeremy after Judy Mugford came forward, that they just kind of adopted the family's theory wholesale. If you look at the theories laid out in Robert Bowflower, Jeremy's uncle's diary, and you look at the cases presented at trial, the amount of overlap is really extraordinary. And most of Robert Bowflower's diary is conjecture. It's guesswork. He wasn't there. He doesn't know what happened. I mean, it includes dialogue between Jeremy and his family as he murdered them, which he's kind of invented. It kind of almost reads like a fan fiction of the crime, and yet the police adopted this as a serious document, it seems, because they followed it very closely. And I think that's part of what went so badly wrong in this case.
And lastly, why do you think the CCRC is so opposed to reinvestigating? Is this just a matter of police protecting police? I mean, that happens here too. It's very hard to convince prosecutors that they themselves made a mistake.
Yeah, I think that's the problem we have here. I mean, the justice experts who I've spoken to have said to me there's been a cover-up at every level of the criminal justice system in this case. The police got it wrong, the Crown Prosecution Service got it wrong, the Court of Appeal got it wrong, the CCRC has got it wrong, and now they've all dug so far into this hole they cannot possibly countenance the idea that they acknowledge that they made such a huge mistake for such a long time in one of the country's most famous ever murder cases. And so I've been told over and over again by these experts, the CCRC, it doesn't matter what fresh evidence comes to light, the CCRC will find a way not to refer this case to the Court of Appeal. And I have to say, I kind of, I thought, surely if you find a piece of evidence that totally turns this thing on its head, they're going to take it seriously. We published this article, it contains evidence that does totally turn this thing upside down. And it's pretty amazing and instructive to me to see the lengths the CCRC went to in the sort of the tortured logic they applied to all of this in the document they produced, in order just to set all of that aside and say it just didn't matter. And so I really hope the CCRC changes tack. There's a new chair who's taken over the organisation after a series of wrongful conviction scandals. She's saying that she wants to restore public trust in the organisation and turn things around. I think that really first order of business for her should be to take a proper look at this case, take a look at the new evidence, take it seriously, and do the right thing here.
I love that good journalism is working, especially these days. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for the work. And
Thank you,
hopefully we get an update soon from you. You've been listening to Crime Story from CBC Podcasts. You can hear the show ad-free by subscribing to CBC True Crime on Apple Podcasts. Be sure to follow us there on Apple or on Spotify. You can also find us on YouTube. Just search and subscribe to CBC True Crime.